to Truth in This Art. I am your host, Rob Lee. Thanks for listening, and please consider subscribing to this channel for more great stories like the one you're about to hear. So today, I am interviewing a Washington, D.C. based painter, Jordann Wine. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. It's great to extend and learn about a new work, new artists, and at least to me, obviously, and to get more of the story. I feel like I'm getting like exclusive level access. That's what I'm feeling. It's almost like the professional or artistic director's commentary. I feel like that's what I'm getting.
Cool. That's exciting to share that. I don't feel exclusive, but cool that I can share that with you.
So let's start off for those who are undipped. Give us the vital stats. Give us a little bit about your background and where does your inspiration come from for your work?
I grew up in the Maryland area, right outside of DC, and moved back to the DC area like 7 or 8 years ago, and really started making art full time about 5 years ago. And I started making art and just loving it. I had always made art like as a kid, made it in high school, took 2 art classes like my senior year. I disconnected from it when I was in college and kind of found it again in my mid-20s, and kind of became like a sponge and was like, creating, making things really helped me. And a large part of that actually has to do with like mental health and well-being, how I found like that connection with art again. So that's how I got there. And what were your other parts of the question?
So that's all good. I talk a lot. Your background, and I think you kind of covered that. And so speak on maybe some of your inspiration. And I think you spoke on a bit of that in terms of the connection to mental health, what have you. But where's some of that inspiration come from for your work?
So I love like math. I love sacred geometry. I love nature. I also really love shiny things. So I work with metallic paints and glitter. So I'm really inspired by all those elements and have tried to create work that's balanced and meditative for viewers, hopefully to feel like a sense of calm. I always like the idea that like if someone sees my work, that maybe they could sit with it for a little bit and feel relaxed and take a break from the busy day.
That's great. So can you talk about some of your, and these are kind of like, just for the flow of it, can you talk about some of your ongoing interests, imagery, concepts that informed your process and your body of work? And how do you anticipate your work maybe progressing in, let's say, the next 5 years, for sake of argument?
Yeah. Ongoing imagery is really the shapes that I use over and over, like triangles, circles. I use triangles within a circle. And then I really like to utilize like a gradient to create a kind of gentle transition from one color to another, or like a dark to a light. The rainbow, if you look at like a rainbow or a color wheel, that's a really good example of a gradient because it kind of smoothly goes from one color to the next. I personally find working with different materials really interesting. I've been painting, working with glitter. I draw, I do mural work. I've recently been exploring like using like yarn and fiber on wood and find that really interesting. One of my brothers is a woodworker and we've collaborated on wood-based items. We've made benches, we've made clocks, we've made some wood inlays. So kind of figuring out how my work could potentially become a little more sculptural, and incorporating different materials is something in the next 5 years that like I think would be really exciting. Medium exploration, like different materials, is really finding ways to express these concepts and maybe exploring concepts using different mathematical forms and shapes and curves. and exploring materials, I think is what I hope for in the next 5 years.
It's great. It's like, this is that progression, like in doing, let's say, doing this podcast or what have you, it's an audio medium. And if I were to transition to do like video, which feels like the next logical step, or radio, which feels like the next logical step, it's familiar, but it's like taking that content to a slightly different space, but still kind of the same idea of taking that practice to a different space.
For sure.
Yeah. So, since we were prepping with this one, I moved this one up because I think it's funny. Describe sacred geometry and what helps you with your creativity.
All right. So sacred geometry, I'm just going to read to you a definition I found online, because to me, it's the easier way than me jumbling it up with what my opinion is of it. But many teachings have described sacred geometry as the blueprint of creation and the genesis of origin of all forms. Sacred geometry is considered an ancient science that explores and explains the energy patterns that create and unify all things, and reveals the precise way that the energy of creation organizes itself. Also, to say, in nature, lots of sacred geometry patterns can be found. Like there's something called the golden ratio, and seashells have this spiral to it that's a mathematical form. You can
Right.
find that same form within plants. Some like the Mona Lisa has been compared using that same golden ratio.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like this idea that there's something that has existed beyond our current time and has potentially been part of how this world was created.
So how did that, forgive me, but how did the concept of the sacred geometry kind of find itself into your work, and what are certain things that kind of help you with your creativity?
I think like I was using sacred geometry concepts without knowing about it.
Okay.
Was what happened. I've always loved math though, so to me it feels connected. But at some point in my career, I started to learn, sacred geometry exists, and understand how I relate to it in the context of my work. And sorry, the other portion was what are
certain things that help you with your creativity? And it's not necessarily like a related, like, hey, it just jumps from sacred geometry to, which is probably why it's like odd, but like some people, when I'll ask this question, it's like, a canvas. So it's like, I know you're a painter. So, but what would you say that those maybe non-related materials or things that help you with your creativity? It's like, hey man, I love getting a latte. It gets me in the right mindset. What are certain things like that in terms of your creativity?
I actually feel very blessed and gifted to just kind of be full of ideas.
Great.
And I've not, some artists talk of creative blocks, and I've certainly had them in ways to accomplish things or wanting to change, but I've definitely had a surplus, an abundance of gifts of like, hey, Jordann, you could create this, 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 and this, and not enough time to create all the stuff that I have ideas for. I don't have a routine like getting a latte, or I know some artists will like sketch and do certain things to find that inspiration. Sure. Certainly looking on Instagram and seeing what some other artists are doing with color or shape and pattern are interesting, and are sometimes good shooting off points to like try something new as well.
So let's go back a little bit. And I moved this question around because I thought it'd be a good starting point, right? Well, good point to be right here. What is one of those first or early art making experiences for you? What's one of those that come to mind for you?
There are a few that really stand out. My mom, when we were kids, like she signed me and my brothers up for art classes, sports. We really were fortunate to have like opportunities to try a lot of different things. And I have a memory of being like 5 or 6 and going to some woman's house in her basement and taking like an art class with like 8 or 12 other kids my age. And I remember like we would use these little canvases that were like hard board canvas. They're just like a board, which they still sell.
Yeah.
And she gave us paint and all these different things to put in the paint to make texture. And so like things were like sand or like rice or other items that you could put on top of it to create different texture. Like I can't remember specifics, but sometimes people would use bubble wrap and create like a pattern out of it. And so I just remember having like this very physical interaction with paints and like getting to touch it and not just having to do it all just with one texture.
Right.
And found it. Clearly, I still remember it like 30 years later. So it was really impactful.
It's wonderful. This one is not the same, but it is similar. This one is about a specific piece and maybe something in the last few years that holds a particularly fond memory for you, and why? Like, was it in going through the process, was it something that really had a story that was attached to it, or like you may have had a showing or something and that had a story attached to it? What's a piece that comes to mind that has particular fond memories to it?
It's a good question. It's like torn because I have like some pieces I've made and then the reaction that people have had to it has been really impactful.
Sure.
And made me like, feel like, oh wow, if people are that impacted by the art, like great, I'm glad I can make it and I'm glad it's helping people. But I guess last summer I made my longest piece on canvas ever, and it was about 16 and a half feet long.
Wow.
Maybe 17 feet and about 4.5 feet tall. And I made it in my studio, like on a wall first, and then rolled it up once it was finished and brought it to the location, which was in downtown DC. Yeah. And they unwrapped it and hung it up while I was there. And what was cool was the client, who was Swatch Room, who organized this project. They're a DC-based design firm. Mm-hmm. They also really supported me and my process and hired a photographer to document the process from beginning to installation. So that was pretty impactful that not only was I commissioned to do such a cool piece, but that they also really wanted to support me and my practice and document it. Yeah. Because that was really cool.
And then doing something that, in terms of the size and scope of it, you were describing, it's like, oh, no, this is a new thing for me. I don't know if I want you to keep that documentation. This could go left.
I mean, I have done murals that are a lot larger.
Sure.
So I felt very comfortable. Although my first large thing of canvas that I hung up, it had like wrinkles in it at the end of the roll, like canvas comes on a roll.
Sure.
And at the end it was wrinkled, and I was like trying to problem solve it and messed up the canvas. So I did have to rehang it. But in the documentation, we didn't talk about that.
Yeah, it's like, just cut that. It's like suddenly George is an executive producer. It's like, trim that out. I'm going to edit this.
Let's just hide that this happened.
Make sure I get credited for this in this manner. It's just like a new skill set that's there. Taking my visual arts to cinema now.
Yes.
So let's talk about consumption. Consumption is very interesting to me, but consumption in this way. Can you share some of your recent influences in this specific kind of space, visual art, literature, film, music, that are specifically important to you? It doesn't have to be all of them, but something that comes to mind in that kind of realm, like. You saw this movie and it's like, wow, that cinematography is great. You were in a movie. That was.
I mean, I personally love science fiction.
Okay.
So I think I get inspiration and consume a boatload of science fiction, specifically in television and movies. I do some audiobooks, and they're more fantasy realms. But what's interesting is a number of movies and shows I've seen recently, like Foundation, Eternals. I've been like, oh, that kind of looks like my work.
Mm-hmm.
And then parts of it like go beyond, and I'm like, wow, how did they come up with this concept? So I do find that as inspirational, but also something that like I love to consume and enjoy. Plant life is also really cool, and bird watching, as other forms of like taking stuff in. Sure. And but yeah, I would say like science fiction.
We'll be talking about science fiction probably off mic, because I'm a science fiction and a horror guy. It's just like I started. We'll talk about it, guys. I don't want to go, because then it just turns into a sci-fi.
Battlestar Galactica. Are you into that show?
I can.
Have you seen that yet?
I can be.
Well, we can talk about that later then.
So I got a couple more questions before I get to these rapid fire ones. I may have just updated one based on something you said. So I read that scheduling vacations or research trips and time out of the studio is really important to help you with that work-life balance. I did the same thing. I took a trip. The most recent one was up to Rhode Island, but I was just in DC on Saturday just to kind of hang out with a couple of friends and get lunch. And something as small as that, is 40 minutes away or what have you, is a departure, and it helps. And it does fill a cup back up. Is there a trip that comes to mind for you that it was particularly helpful in kind of helping you fill that cup back up, maybe creatively or just giving you a respite?
This balance of being like a solo entrepreneur, freelancer, and the income is really reliant on what you produce. It's been really hard over the years to like, hey, let me take a vacation. Hey, let me schedule a vacation.
Sure.
Or let me go visit friends. I've relied more on them coming to visit me. And the more that I let that sit with me, the more I felt like, hey, this doesn't feel great, that I'm not also partaking and taking the time to make sure I go visit them. So actually, last April to October was incredibly busy. Mm-hmm. And kind of exhausting. And so in October, I took time off and went up to the Berkshires, visited some friends, and then went up to Burlington, Vermont, visited other friends. And then I'm making that trip back up there in a few weeks, actually. And I'm going to add on 2 other friends to see, because they're friends that are like really important to me. Yeah. Not in this area. And the pandemic has also slowed all that kind of stuff down. But after I did that trip in October, I came back and I said, wow, my cup really feels full. And recognizing like, hey, my cup was filled by seeing the friends and connecting with them and giving myself that downtime.
It's big. I think in doing this and in doing the other podcast interests that I have, I'm always sitting there writing notes, and at the tail end or coming up with something and observing in that way. So it always feels like for instance, I do a movie review podcast outside of this, and sometimes I have to delineate between, am I watching this for enjoyment or is this for work? And sometimes trips are that way as well. But generally, if I go traveling to like a different city, going to where the art's at, to be really colloquial about it, or going to a museum, coffee shops, that's just what I do, now. But I have to try to find a way to enjoy it for going there's sake, and maybe return before the trip is over to maybe research or get inspired in that way to maybe come up with what question is striking me. How did they get that way? And I may not speak to the artist that did it, but I may speak to an artist that's similar and have better and more informed questions.
Yeah.
And I find like in the last trip, it was funny because I was like, all right, it's wrapping up. I got a movie review to do when I get back to Baltimore, and I got some interviews to do next week. Let me just come up with some questions. I just went to a coffee shop, but I had so much energy because the setting in which I do the questions was different, and it was just a different vibe and energy, and I was just going through it because in doing some of the interviews, they might be about 2 hours of research, and you don't want to like look foolish, like you're talking to someone. It's like, oh, I don't do that anymore. That was me 10 years ago. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
And I can try to BS my way through it, but I can only BS so much. It's like,
right.
No, I don't do that anymore, actually.
Right. I think also going back to this vacation aspect of it, or like taking time away, like sometimes it can bring in a little fun and play to do even the same thing you're doing, but just not in your home base area. And it can help loosen some things up in your brain so that it doesn't feel repetitive, daunting, whatever it is that's kind of holding you down a little bit and stuck.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Completely agree. So now we're at, see, this is where we start to shift into the latter part of this, the real part of the interview. So aside from your work and things related to your work, practices related to your work, do you have any other creative interests or talents? I used to say, like, what's your weird talent? Which one do you have? What other interests or talents do you have outside of your work?
I personally love organizing stuff. So like if someone's house is messy and they need help, I'd be like, oh, I'll volunteer and help you clean it out and organize it. Like I freaking love it. I've done it for people, and I've done it for like my brother's business. I've done it for other artists who like need some help. I've done it for my studio. I did it when I was like 12 years old for a friend. Like I love it. Okay. So I'm good at it and I love it. It brings me a lot of joy to clean stuff out, get rid of it, and find homes for it. Because I find once you have an organized space and know where those things are, you can spend however much time being messy and like being silly and enjoy being playful about it. Yeah. But you don't have to waste time figuring out where all the stuff is.
That's true. That's very true.
And cleanup is easier. So organization is huge. I also love plants and like really got into like growing like house plants and propagating them and seeing what happened and like watching them really go from like tiny to like so those are some of my hobbies and alternative interests.
So we have more things to trade notes on, because I'm not disorganized, but it's like I got a bunch of files right there, and it's like you need to put those. Oh, I'm one of those guys. Yeah, and houseplants come to my studio to die, and this is why I haven't brought in. I have a kokodama that I've named Nakamura. It's like it's a type of art. I'll send you an image.
Okay.
But it's like this weaving, almost like a bonsai tree with like this weaving bottom. Okay. And I was like, nah, I can't have him come over here. I can't have Nakamura here. He's gonna die. I gotta leave with a friend. Someone else take care of him, please. It's like almost it's like shared custody almost.
Well, knowing your boundaries is important. Knowing your skills and abilities, and with the organizational stuff, like if you have a place for it to go, well, that's good. And maybe just on your calendar, you schedule once a week to do it. Or at the end of the day, you have 15 extra minutes to put stuff away.
That's true.
These are ideas that come from like lean manufacturing, not necessarily my own like genius.
I like how you said genius there. I appreciate that. Sometimes even in this studio, what have you, which is the reason there's a green screen behind me. I have only thing organized in here is like my microphones and my Funko Pops. Everything else is just like disarray. It's like, are those socks? Why are they in here?
Well, you might benefit from a little organization.
Yes. Noted. Noted. Yeah. So let's talk about this last question before we get into this rapid fire. So if you will, if you don't mind, could you describe that relationship between, like mental health and creativity? Cause I know for myself, I have my different mental health, like challenges and things, and what I'm doing creatively, sometimes they bump up against each other, and that's a whole thing. But then other times it's like, going back and doing the podcast, not this one, but podcasting as a whole, as long as I have, I remember points where I was like, wow, I was depressed then, or wow, I was a really happy individual at this time. And sometimes the content or the approach in the content is impacted by where I was at mentally.
Yeah. Yeah. So mental health is always seems to be an ongoing journey for us humans. But I struggled with depression, and it kind of became more clear in college, and then really clear like in my early 20s, like 23 to 26 or so. So I had told my mom, I feel like I'm in a black hole. And she's like, maybe you should talk to this therapist who I had talked to when I was younger. And thankfully I could hear her when she said that and wasn't like, what are you talking about? And I was like, okay. And so I had this woman didn't live where I lived anymore. And so we had like a phone. She was my therapist over the phone. And at a certain point around like, I think 26, it was like, okay, I really need to do something about this, or else I'll kind of be living as like a walking zombie. The depression was just pretty deep rooted, and I had pretty negative self-talk, and I was able to still get stuff done and do stuff, but it was not like thriving or really living. It was just kind of existing. And so I moved out to the small town in Idaho, which is where the therapist was living. And I thankfully had time and resources to see her 2 to 3 times a week and exercise and volunteer and kind of reset. I call it my own like form of rehab because I didn't know what else to do, and this just felt comfortable to do that type of work with her, the therapist at the time. And it started to help me because I could see her regularly and talk through the things that I was really struggling with, and kind of incrementally make these small changes because it was a big hurdle. I also took some medicine. So to me personally, the experience was like very well balanced because I had support from multiple different like modalities. But when I moved out to Idaho, I started drawing again. I started making art again. I had not made art other than like once a year for like 6-7 years probably. And so in my first weeks out there, I really just started doodling and watching Netflix because Netflix was like new at the time, ish. And I spent like 10 hours doodling and drawing, and I couldn't believe how good it made me feel. And I was like, okay, well, I forgot that making things using my hands was actually a really important part of my well-being. And so like now when I reflect on it, I'd say like 40 to 50% of my depression was healed because I started making art again. And the remainder was healed with a lot of therapy, some medicine and movement. But making art helped me. I now know that like, even if I didn't make art professionally, even if I wasn't able to sell it, I would still make it because for my own well-being, my own like existence, that's what I need.
All right. Now I can make an ass out of myself now. So I got a few rapid fire questions. And pretty much the way that these rapid fire questions work is, I just ask you the question. You just give me the answer as briefly as you can make it. Hence the notion of rapid fire. Oh
boy.
All right. So we can even add audiobook to this first question. What did you read or audiobook? Because I do a lot of audiobooks myself now. Most recently, what was the most recent consumed piece of literature you had? Book, audiobook, however.
Well, I'm in the middle of one right now, but I can't think of the name actually. But Wheel of Time, which is a 15 book series, and now an Amazon TV show.
Okay.
I finished that recently, the whole series. So I'm kind of proud of that.
Okay, good on you. Good on you. Points. Overachiever, I see.
Well, it's really fun to listen to. So
yeah, I've just been listening to a lot of like 48 Laws of Power and like some crime books, and I did finish the Andre Leon Talley memoir, which was great.
Cool.
It was a lot of fun. And I had a real life experience that reading listened to that book like maybe 3 times, and in like a week. And I was just like, this thing that I'm experiencing, going to this like art opening or just got this exhibition opening. I was like, this is how you navigate this. And it was just stuff that he was talking about navigating the fashion world.
Yeah. Did he narrate it too?
Yes, he did.
I assume. Oh, cool.
I listened to it on 1.2 or 1.3, so it makes it sound even funnier. Because it's like he's just rapidly
sped up a little.
Yes, it's great. Yeah, everybody listening to this podcast, listen to the podcast at 1.3. You can listen to more in one day. Star Trek or Star Wars? Star Trek.
It's hard to say though, because Grogu and Baby Yoda, I don't know.
Now, this is a 2-parter right here. Favorite sci-fi movie and favorite sci-fi series?
Battlestar Galactica series, like hands down.
Okay.
Doctor Who's the second runner-up, but Battlestar Galactica, like they like made that just perfect. Movie Avatar.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's considered sci-fi. Yeah, sci-fi.
It is. I mean, people are blue at one point, and
and on another planet.
There you go. And and Sigourney Weaver is somehow there in another James Cameron movie. So there you go. I mean, So the last one I have is, because I heard movement fitness is a thing I've noticed in reading over some of your stuff. What is your favorite exercise?
I wish I was more active right now. But I played basketball growing up, so I still like to shoot around a little.
Okay.
And I personally love rock climbing, but have had kind of like, because of my art, it's impacted like the way I can use my arm. So I don't rock climb anymore, but loved rock climbing because it's like a puzzle. You're like, you're active, but solving a puzzle.
I like that. And I got a shooter's vibe from you when you mentioned basketball. I was like, you're a guard or something? What are we doing here?
I was like a 3-4, like small forward, or like now I can't think of words.
A little stretch 4 right there.
Passing guard, kind of. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm like 5. I'm 5'9", so you wouldn't be able to tell from the video that we're on and talking.
Yeah, people can't tell that I'm 6'4" usually.
No. No.
Yeah.
Surprised. Mind blown.
So when I met Emma, she was just like, because she's like 5'1" or whatever.
Right. Yep.
So that's literally all of the questions that I had, but I want to, 1, thank you for being on this podcast, and 2, I want to invite you to tell the fine folks where to check out more of your work, social media, all of that good stuff. So feel free, have at it.
All right. So my name is Jordann with 2 N's, so Jordann, last name Wine, Wine, like you drink. And my website is my name, Jordann with 2 N's, wine.com, and Instagram is at Jordann Wine. So that's really the best ways to find me.
So there you have it, folks. I want to thank the great Jordann Wine for coming on to this podcast. And I am saying that there is art in and around your city. You just got to look for it.